Hello viewers, and welcome to yet another Warhammer 40,000 Conquest video production. My name is Mitch, and I am the Hive Tyrant. Today, we're going to be taking a look at the non-signature cards for the Orks faction that were included within the core set. In this video, I'm only going to be taking a look and discussing the card combinations and synergy present within the core set itself, but in later videos I'll be reviewing each and every one of this game's released and upcoming war packs and deluxe expansions. Although this video is going to focus on card analysis primarily from the perspective of an Orks player, I'll nevertheless touch on any synergy with loyal Astra Militarum and Chaos faction cards where appropriate. Although I'm sure to miss some uses for these cards over the course of the video, be sure to mention your personal favorites in the comments. But with that said, let's get things started with the first of our Orks army units. First and foremost, we have the Bad Dok, a 2-cost unit with 1 command icon, 1 attack value, 4 hit points, the Odd Boy and Knob traits, and the text, "This unit gains 3 command icons while it is damaged." So there is a lot to say about this unit, but to start things off, let's take a look at its ability and command icon. So for a cost of 2, there are certainly plenty of other units that have the same command phase presence that this unit does. In fact, the Ork player has access to better options in the equivalently costed Chaos Fanatics, which, although their pool of hit points is half as deep, they nevertheless have double the command icons. But in taking a look at this army unit's ability, it nevertheless has the enormous potential to accrue 3 additional icons, putting it at a grand total of 4, which is really only rivaled by the enormously expensive Astra Militarum loyal Leman Russ battle tank. Granted, this army unit has nowhere near the same combat ability as the battle tank does, and if it just so happens that the Ork player is able to leverage that ability in their favor, this army unit very quickly gains a rather significant ability to win command struggles. The earlier you can start accruing additional cards and gaining additional resource tokens, the quicker you're going to be able to build tempo, start a snowball effect, and hopefully speed toward victory all the faster. But the problem inherent to this card is that it is a little bit difficult to trigger that ability, and on a unit-by-unit basis, it doesn't necessarily outperform your opponent based purely on its command icon value alone. And if your opponent is able to pull ahead of you, if you're not able to gain the benefit of that ability, even within the Ork faction alone, even discounting any potential allied army units, you have better options for leveraging 1 early game command icon up against your enemy. So the problem with this army is that without that ability, it's not really doing too much for you, apart from sitting on the board, maybe matching your opponent's command presence, but granted, it does have quite a bit more survivability than some equivalently costed units. Like the Dark Eldar Incubus Warrior, even though it hits a hell of a lot harder than the Bad Dok does, Bad Dok outcompetes it in a strictly combat sense, even though it beats him out during the command phase. So if it's unable to take damage, it seems very much a trade-off with this unit. And regarding combat potential, seeing as how the only Ork warlord we've seen within the confines of the core set itself is Nosdrag, having that deep pool of 4 hit points does confer this unit some significant combat ability, if it just so happens to accrue not 1 or 2, but a possible 3 points of damage, which would bolster its attack value up to 4. But at that point, it's so wounded that your opponent can leverage any number of effects in his or her favor in order to deal that killing blow and dispatch this enemy. And as with any unit that has the brutal keyword, if this unit ends up attacking prior to your opponent putting a bunch of damage on this guy, then he's not actually going to gain any additional attack power just by the merit of having all of those additional damage tokens. They just serve no better purpose than to make him more and more vulnerable. And if at any point your warlord retreats, he loses that ability. If you're not piloting Nosdrag while playing him, he not only loses that ability, but the best means to get him into play, the signature event Bigga is Beta, you don't have access to that at all. So really all you're doing is investing potentially too many resources in a unit that may not be doing much for you. And as soon as he ends up getting swept into your warlord's retinue, seeing as how combat is the most normal means for these units to be taking damage, which would have the benefit of triggering his ability, at that point, command icons serve no purpose whatsoever, because regardless as to what your opponent's command presence is, so long as your warlord is uncontested by the enemy warlord, you simply win by default. So, Bad Dok certainly has some different interesting options. He's certainly playable in either a primarily combat or primarily command role, but he doesn't necessarily do either of those particularly well, at least without the help of other cards. And the more cards, the more resources, the more abilities, whether it's exhausting a unit, whatever it happens to be, everything that you're investing in one army unit could potentially cost you the tempo against your opponent that you'd be hoping to build with an effective command unit. For instance, one option you have of putting damage onto your own soldiers is the support Orc cannon, which we'll cover in much greater detail a little bit later in this video. Not only can that potentially harm your opponent, but it can damage your units, and if you can opt to trigger the Bad Dok's effect, then maybe, if you're going up against enemy units, you do benefit from that ability. But the issue there is that you have to wait until combat to trigger that action, and if you have better targets for your support, not only are you not getting the benefit on that first turn, because you have to wait until after the command phase, but additionally, you're giving up the opportunity to use that support to maybe snipe one of your opponent's very low-cost command units, like a Void Pirate, Rogue Trader, any number of different options along those lines. And if your Bad Dok isn't directly opposed, whether it has one command icon or four, that ultimately might not make any difference. So it just strikes me that, as with almost any Orc unit that we've seen so far and the way that the faction as a whole is constructed, that this guy is really swinging for the fences in that he's either marginally effective or that he's so above and beyond enormously effective that a lot of the resources that you're investing in this card, its design real estate, as it were, is going to be essentially wasted. For instance, if you're running unopposed during the command phase, it would be much better to be having this card designed with a different ability entirely, or simply opting to run a different card. Just like with that brutal keyword, if you end up with an attacker that has 15 attack value thanks to stacking hit points via hostile environment gear and cyborg body, if your enemy only has 3 hit points worth of units to destroy, you're wasting so much attack power that at that point it's just extraordinarily inefficient. And if somehow you could reel that attack value in to redistribute that card real estate into the area of HP or reduced cost or any number of other things, it would just be so much more valuable over the course of a fight. So the Orc faction just strikes me as a lot of exciting potential, a lot of moments where, if this were a video game, it would be the random number generator, or RNG, the odds are coming up in your favor. I think it would create a lot of memorable moments that are just awesome and just fantastic, where maybe you're able to wound Bad Dok, and it makes all the difference, winning you some resources, some card that you play against your opponent and just decimate him or her. But I think even though those individual circumstances might stand out in your mind, there's going to be just as many, if not more, situations where you find yourself frustrated because your units have all this potential, but they're not doing much for you. They're just sitting there being, unfortunately, ineffective. Certainly, it's not all bad looking at the bad Dok. If you're running up against a Chaos player, it certainly punishes them a little bit more if they happen to trigger a Warp Storm against you, because this unit certainly survives and benefits from having additional command icons. Or if you're the one that's leveraging Warp Storm against your opponent, it could very well make excellent use of this ability if you deploy him knowing full well that you're going to be benefiting from having a 4 command icon unit sitting at that planet. If he does get swept up in your Warlord's retinue, having that pool of hit points, if he is undamaged, he is likely to survive at least the initial round of combat or so that he might be able to amass some damage. Certainly if you're playing multiple copies of the Orc cannon, and it becomes a little bit more friendly to triggering that effect at will, you can use that to pretty decent effect in prepping for the next turn as well. So, while I certainly think that this unit has potential, I think the Orc player also has better options when it comes to attackers, when it comes to command icon heavy units. There's certainly a wide margin for victory or defeat. This is probably going to perform as a very erratic and inconsistent unit. But then again, if you're buying into the Orks faction, and particularly if you're piloting Nosdrag, I would hope that you get pretty quickly comfortable with a little bit of inconsistency. I've certainly said much ado about one unit with bad Dok, but ultimately I think it just comes down to your having to ask yourself, particularly as our card pool expands, are you willing to make the investment in having enough cards in your deck to get this unit to function? If not, does he do what you're hoping he will? Or, quite simply, would the space he occupies be better taken up by more specialized, focused, and concentrated army units? But after that admittedly lukewarm start to the Orcish army, let's crank up the heat with one of my personal favorite units, the Orcish Army Burna Boyz, with a cost of 4, 1 command icon, an attack value of 5, and 3 hit points. It has the Warrior and Boys traits and reaction. After this unit declares an attack against an enemy unit, deal 1 damage to a different enemy unit at the same planet. So, quite obviously, this unit has a staggeringly high attack power compared to some similarly costed units we've seen. Not only is it able to hammer an initial target relatively hard after it declares an attack, but you also get the additional benefit of splashing a single point of damage onto another enemy so long as they happen to be at the same planet. And oh so important to note is that it's enemy unit, so warlords, armies, and tokens are all eligible. You might be able to splash a bit of damage onto the enemy warlord, getting them ever closer to being bloodied or eventually defeated and destroyed, or it might just so happen that you can benefit from sending a cultist or chimera token to an early grave. It has a little bit of built-in versatility in that it does have some small command presence, so even deployed to a planet by its lonesome, it could potentially win you some cards or resources, but quite clearly the obvious downside to this card is that it does have a relatively small pool of hit points, and considering that if you're playing Nosdrag, you're going to want to be benefiting as much as possible from that brutal keyword, this unit, particularly compared to a lot of his Orcish others, doesn't necessarily have much room to increase that attack power much further. So for that reason, seeing as how you've got the Astra Militarum Imperial Guard as an ally possibility, you might want to affix hostile environment gear to him just to boost that HP reservoir up to 6, or if you're running with Chaos, certainly the rune-encrusted armor could be a fantastic choice, simply because at that point, even though you've invested 6 resources and 2 cards all into one non-elite, non-unique, relatively vulnerable target, at that point it's got a pretty respectable 7 attack, 5 hit points, and that ability. Although also worth considering is that if you're not running into multiple units at the same planet, you don't actually get to trigger that beneficial effect. So if there's only one enemy unit for you to take shots at, there's no second enemy unit to splash damage onto. And if it just so happens that you're running up against multiple units, unless you've got some backup for your Burna Boyz, then the likelihood of them being destroyed, because they've got potentially multiple incoming attacks, it gets all the more likely you'll ultimately lose all the resources you've invested in a fragile unit like this one. In a one-on-one context, it makes me think of the oh-so-much more survivable Assault Valkyrie, which is non-loyal, and as you can ally with the Imperial Guard, you could potentially play. That's 4 attack, which isn't as high, but it's 4 hit points, and importantly, the flying keyword. So depending on what your meta is, Burna Boyz may or may not be worth including, strictly on the basis of your opponent alone. Against a Dark Eldar Chimera Swarm, it could be fantastic, but against something like a Space Marine player, where they're investing the same amount in far fewer, much more durable, and in return hard-hitting targets, it might ultimately be less valuable to include the Burna Boyz in your deck. And something else to be aware of is that if your opponent has a lot of ranged attackers, for instance the Baleful Mandrake, unless you've got an abundance of shield cards in your hand, or a Rockcrete Bunker, or any number of other effects to mitigate some of the damage coming toward this unit, it might be absolutely trivial for your opponent to get rid of this. He could be Archon's Terrored at an inopportune time, Deception could bounce him back to your hand, and then all of those resources you've invested would be immediately wasted. And particularly if you are loading this guy up with attachments, that single card could make a pretty devastating economic effect upon you. Seeing as how the Orks within their own faction don't have access to any area effect, unless you're willing to put a Mordian Hellhound in your deck, when it itself may end up being a questionable investment, you don't really have access to a whole lot of means to splash damage across multiple units. We've mentioned Orc Cannon before, but in that situation, your opponent has the choice, in many cases, where that indirect damage goes. So, certainly, as with so many other Orc units, the Burna Boyz have awesome potential. When used to the utmost of their ability, they can deal a pretty enormous amount of damage. They can potentially kill 2 enemies with every single attack, and seeing as how brutal may not be the best keyword to have working in their favor, if you're including them in a Zarather Chaos deck, that splash reaction deals essentially 2 points of damage, and seeing as how they're warriors, whether you're an Orc warlord leveraging Elysian Assault team in your favor, or whether you simply decide to run them in a Colonel Strachan deck, that itself can nevertheless provide some pretty significant benefits. So certainly there are a lot of options with the Burna Boyz. I love them from a thematic standpoint, but whether or not they're really worth consideration for including in your deck, when it comes down to it, is totally up to you. So, certainly an option to consider, certainly a card to keep an eye on as the card pool grows, but unless you're able to affix, at this point, our only Orcish attachment to him to give him ranged, unfortunately, this does strike me as yet another potentially very exciting Orcish unit that, nevertheless, in all likelihood may end up ultimately letting you down. But, in any case, next up we have the unique Orc army unit, Crushface. With a cost of 3, 2 command icons, a loyal icon, an attack value of 2, 3 hit points, the warrior and knob traits, and interrupt. When you deploy another Orc unit at this planet, reduce its cost by 1. So, immediately, as with so many other unique characters, what really makes them special is their ability. I love that it does help to build some tempo in your favor and give you some resource advantage or acceleration, in that so long as you continue deploying Orc units, you continue to save resources a single token at a time. It doesn't necessarily have the highest base attack value or pool of hit points, but for that cost, it clocks in to me at pretty reasonable. It's got the same warrior synergy with the Elysian Assault team I mentioned earlier, and if you're deploying this guy to a planet even by his lonesome, that's a very significant number of command icons with which to gain additional resources and additional cards. Something particularly important to consider with this unique army unit is that you probably want to delay or prevent his being swept into your warlord's retinue for as long as possible, if not entirely, because as soon as he's in your headquarters, where you cannot directly deploy Orc units, you can no longer benefit from his resource-saving ability. And as soon as you've got command icon heavy units deploying alongside your warlord, whoever that happens to be, you're no longer benefiting from his command icons under most circumstances either. What is an exciting possibility is that if at any point we start seeing cards that allow you to ambush Orcs into play, you will be able to take full advantage of his ability at that point. But unfortunately, that effect is not all upside, because it does require you specifically to deploy Orcs to the planet at which he's located. And therefore, to get the utmost of this ability, you not only have to play him early during a given deployment phase, or at least before you intend to deploy any other Orc units, but where you're likely to start deploying a large number of Orcs is going to be extraordinarily obvious to your opponent. And plus, to save as many resources as possible, you probably want to accumulate as many resources as possible, just so you can put him into play and then deploy Orc after Orc after Orc. And if you're keeping him far away from the first planet, where you can potentially benefit from his effect turn after turn, then you're potentially exposing yourself to nasty effects like Exterminatus, and although Exterminatus cannot destroy him, it nevertheless does have the potential to easily obliterate every other Orc unit you happen to have deployed at his planet. So, for that reason, even though he's entirely immune to the likes of Archon's terror, you nevertheless want to be very careful in knowing not only what kind of opponent you're up against, but particularly what specific cards might cause an enormous number of problems for you. To help circumvent some of the downside inherent to his interrupt, you can use the Teleportapad support to move units from his planet to the first planet, just because that specific location is always guaranteed to have a battle taking place each and every game round, so with that combination, you could potentially benefit from some, over the course of the game, significant resource reduction, considering that this is an army unit with respectable base stats that also saves you resources on playing other units. Ultimately, he could pretty easily provide an enormous value to you. And certainly, even though he is unique, you're more than welcome to include multiple copies of him in your deck, just in case you end up deploying him frequently into the thick of combat, just to make sure that all of those resource-reduced Orcs are exactly where you need them to deal as much damage as possible. So, particularly relative to the last two units we covered, I very much like Crushface. I think he's got some pretty fantastic potential. He's going to be maybe a little too consistent for most Orcs players in that he is quite likely to be rather predictable for your opponent, but all the same, if you've been saving some resource tokens, you could drop some nasty surprises on your opponent far earlier than he or she may otherwise be expecting, or simply put way more units into play than they could be anticipating. So, all in all, I think it's safe to color me pretty fond of this greenskin. But on to the next unit, we have the Enraged Orc, an army unit with the cost of 2, 1 command icon, a loyal icon, 0 attack value, 5 hit points, and the built-in brutal keyword, in addition to the warrior and boys traits. So, straight away, for the same resource investment as Bad Dok, he additionally confers upon you 1 command icon, but for better or worse, his inherent attack value is even lower at a staggering 0. All the same, that enormous pool of 5 hit points on a 2-cost unit possesses some pretty enormous potential in that it's entirely possible for this Enraged Orc, damaged to his utmost, to have a modified 4 attack value, which, if you're fortunate enough to leverage that in your favor, could make an enormous difference, and for that low resource investment, that is a pretty significant value. The problem is that with this unit, as with any unit that has the brutal keyword, whether it's ephemeral through Nosdrag or whether it's printed on the card, as is the case with this army unit, it's going to be difficult to balance the number of damage that they're taking with wanting to get as much attack value as possible out of that effect. For instance, as soon as he hits 1 hit point, even though he's going to be striking enormously hard, at the same time he's equally vulnerable. So at that point, any single point of splash damage, it could be an opponent's Burna Boyz, it could be a Tzeentch's Firestorm with 1 direct damage. Whatever it happens to be, at that point he becomes trivially difficult for your opponent to eliminate from the face of the battlefield. But certainly you need not let him get that vulnerable in the first place, so it's going to be a bit of a balancing act. And even if your opponent is unwilling to participate by doting points of damage upon this unit, you can use Orc Cannon, as I've mentioned before, to put a point of damage beneficially onto this unit, in addition to assigning a point to your opponent to have him or her deal with in what's likely to be a much less agreeable sense. Although it's not normally the case, brutal units can often benefit from the opponent having initiative, just because attacking something is not optional, and if he's the only target, or if he's the least egregious or offensive target for your opponent, if they have to put 2 or so damage tokens onto this unit, then you can attack with him just to make sure that you get some damage back onto your opponent before they ultimately eliminate him, even in a situation where they're ultimately bound to win a battle. One of the other problems, though, inherent to brutal units is that your opponent can very frustratingly pick exactly where they want to attack. So if they manage to hit him for 1, in the case that they outnumber you, if he has a single damage token, then attacks for 1, and is then exhausted for the rest of the combat round, if your opponent ultimately keeps attacking him, keeps placing damage tokens on him, he's not going to magically be able to ready to hit your opponent all the harder than he otherwise did. So even if you have a large number of brutal units, your opponent, playing smartly and intelligently, can attack in a sense where they really minimize the benefit that you gain from that effect. And of course, if you are playing Nosdrag, then at that point that ability is a little bit redundant, and the resource value that the design space of this card equates to, that was used to give him that keyword, is in that sense essentially wasted, although certainly he's got the added flexibility at that point where you could put him onto a planet, he could do some fighting, and your warlord could be fighting elsewhere, giving other units brutal. Certainly, he does get pretty enormous effect from any of the HP or attack power boosting attachments, just because, whatever the case, he either hits harder, or lives longer to hit harder, or lives longer to hit harder and hit more times, so in that sense, attachments could be pretty decent value invested in this card. But, just like I've mentioned before, since he's not elite, since he's not unique, the more resources you sink into any one unit, and it's not like this guy's indestructible in the first place, the more likely you are to set yourself up for a 1 or 2 resource card effect, really frustrating you enormous amounts. I think whether it's the Enraged Orc, or we're talking about any unit whatsoever that has that brutal keyword, it's going to be very important that you hold on to some shield cards so that if your opponent thinks they're being clever and uses some sort of opportunistic means to try and kill off one of your brutal units, that you're able to deploy one of those intervening shield cards to make sure that maybe your unit's not only spared from death, but additionally that under ideal circumstances, your army unit is very ready to swing back and obliterate some enemy on the opposing side of the battlefield. Considering again that Orks can ally with Chaos, this is yet another unit that could potentially benefit from the timely use of a Warp Storm. That damage does certainly affect him, but in that case you're at least getting some good with the bad as well. Really, the last things I can think of to mention about this card are that its non-existent base attack value may give your opponent enough time to retreat if you happen to surprise them with deploying this unit, so that maybe your Enraged Orc doesn't take much damage, even though it may take some, so the damage you dish back in return to your opponent doesn't make much of a difference. But if you can force a retreat, then you get to trigger that battle ability, which in and of itself could provide a pretty enormous benefit. So this is yet another very interesting Orcish unit. It's got enormous potential, as do so many others, but it's also got an equivalent likelihood of ultimately disappointing you. I think if you're feeling incredibly risky, or the mathematics of combat just so happen that it works out in your favor, always remember that again, if you are allied with Chaos, it might be worth deploying Dire Mutation as a surprise onto this unit, just because if all you need is maybe the opportunistic additional single point of attack in order to kill or seal the deal on destroying an opposing army unit, as soon as he declares an attack, he takes 1 damage from that attachment, and then you go through damage resolution, where he's got that additional damage token, and deals, in turn, an additional damage token to your opponent. So, certainly a combo that's unlikely to see frequent play, but as with any of these cards, I think it's of the utmost importance that we always strive to educate ourselves as to every single possibility of working these cards with one another to squeeze the absolute utmost benefit out of each and every effect. Up next is yet another army unit in the 1-cost Goff boys, also with printed 0 attack value, 2 hit points, and the warrior, boys, and ally traits. Importantly, they have the text, "This unit gets +3 attack while it is at the first planet." So, despite their no command presence whatsoever, this is an extraordinarily cheap, albeit vulnerable unit that nevertheless has the potential to leverage some very serious attack power against any opponent, so long as they're sitting at the first planet. If it just so happens to gain that brutal keyword and takes a point of damage somehow, maybe through its being the least offensive target for an orc cannon, or maybe you dump a Weirdboy Maniac into play at its location and choose to trigger that reaction, in that circumstance, it does have the potential to attack for 4, which for a 1-cost unit, whether it's 3, whether it's 4, so long as it isn't 0, is a pretty enormous benefit. Although again, this unit has no value during the command phase, compared to something like the respectably hard-hitting Dark Eldar Incubus Warrior, this less fragile unit can potentially do just as much damage, albeit for, in this case, an even smaller resource expenditure. Likewise, if you're bound and determined to get 4 attack power out of this unit, it's got the warrior trait, and as it's not loyal, it would make a fine addition to a Colonel Strachan-led Imperial Guard deck. And of course, as with any other warrior, in that context, it synergizes not only with the Cadian Mortar Squad and Elysian Assault Team, but a host of other effects as well. I think the absolute best way to view this 1-cost unit is as entirely expendable, just because even if it happens to be so fortunate as to survive combat at the first planet, it's ultimately going to be swept into your headquarters, and during that next game round, commit alongside your warlord and arriving at some additional battle exhausted, with 2 hit points at most, which is quite clearly going to make it a very vulnerable target indeed. It's possible, in that case, that you could use your teleportapad, if you don't have any better targets, to send that to the first planet ahead of committing your warlord. But outside of very rare exceptions like that one, I think this cheap, inexpensive Orcish unit is largely throwaway. In combat, this unit might end up drawing a bit of fire from your opponent, but whether that's a good or bad thing seems like it's going to vary tremendously based on where the damage tokens have been stacking up and which of your units do or don't benefit from that brutal keyword. All the same, it doesn't have any base command icons, but if you're looking to surprise your opponent, you could potentially wait until later in the deployment phase, put this onto a planet, and then attach a promotion to it, so at the very least you might be able to steal a command struggle on that given round, or perhaps force your opponent into committing their warlord to a planet that they'd rather not, so certainly the Goff boys have the potential to be sneaky, to make a big difference during a fight. If you're the one with the initiative token, this is very likely to be one of the units you want to attack with first, just because not only are they very likely to get killed early on during any given battle, but seeing as how you're going to want to wait to attack with some of your more brutal units until they've taken some damage, drawn some enemy fire, this guy could ultimately shift some fights in your favor. So I'm sure I sound like a broken record at this point, but as with so many Orcish units, it's certainly flexible, it can fill a great many different roles, and while it may not be on the table for long, while it is in play, it could nevertheless confer a pretty significant benefit to you. But on to the biggest and baddest of our Orcish units, we have the Goff Knob. With a cost of 5, it has a loyal icon, 6 attack, 6 hit points, and the warrior, knob, and elite traits. So, immediately this strikes me as a rather vanilla unit, but it can nevertheless leverage some serious stats against your opponent. Hitting for 6 is certainly no joke, and it's extraordinarily durable on top of that. Whether or not you have Nozdreg as your chosen warlord to give this guy the brutal keyword to drive that attack value to still greater heights, he's nevertheless quite likely to deal out some enormous blows to your opponent's individual units. Even committed to a planet alongside your warlord, despite arriving exhausted, he's hopefully quite likely to survive that initial round of combats, and he not only has the benefit of, in that case, soaking a ton of enemy damage, but there are a host of extraordinarily nasty effects that can take this, granted very expensive unit, and turn him into something absolutely devastating to your opponent. For instance, I think the absolute best use for this elite unit is if it just so happens that he's destroyed, hopefully after dispatching some of your opponent's units himself, you can play Fall Back to immediately return him to play, ready, back at your headquarters. If it just so happens that you've got Teleportapad in play as one of your supports, ready and unexhausted, as soon as you've got an action window after your opponent attacks, there is no better opportunity than to trigger your support, move him immediately to the first planet, and have him start attacking all over again. So not only do they have to chew through those 6 hit points again, but he can kill any number of potentially very expensive and suddenly exposed enemy units. An unanticipated 6 or more damage is never going to be something your opponent is wanting to see. Plus, even though that devastating combo is unlikely to often be available to you, just given the sheer number of resources it requires and cards that are necessary, you may have access to alternative means of taking your opponent by surprise, simply by playing this card with Nosdrag's signature event, which reduces his cost to 3, with or without Crushface, which would drop his final cost to an enormously valuable 2. Whether or not you can or choose to add Teleportapad's effect on top of that incredible combo is up to you based on your draw, based on what you include in your deck. But regardless, despite having no ability of his own, he's nevertheless a powerful tool for the Orc player to leverage against their opponent. It is rather unfortunate that although he is immune to deception, he's nevertheless entirely susceptible to Archon's terror, but again, if you do happen to be running multiple copies of Teleportapad, it may just so happen that you could counter and essentially nullify that opponent's potentially devastating effect. Really, the biggest downside to this unit is he has absolutely no command presence whatsoever, but he's certainly a fantastic damage sponge. He's a very reasonable platform with which to affix any number of different attachments, whether you're boosting up his stats even higher, whether or not you're able to give him ranged, whatever it happens to be. This is yet another Orc unit with enormous potential, but whether or not you're going to be able to wring every last drop of value out of this card certainly remains to be seen and is likely to be rather inconsistent from game to game. So, moving right along, and certainly strikingly dissimilar to our Goff knob, next up we have the Rocket Boy, a 2-cost army unit with 1 command icon, 2 attack value, 2 hit points, the Warrior and Boys traits, and the text, each enemy unit at this planet loses the flying keyword. So, in taking a look at this guy's statistical distribution, there's nothing too enormously special to see here. It's got a small command presence, it has a relatively small attack value, and following that trend, it also has a relatively small pool of hit points. It costs more than something like the Goff Boys, but at the same time, it's got a built-in command phase presence, and if it just so happens that you're needing to deploy a unit away from the first planet, this certainly has more built-in attack value to boot. It may or may not be able to derive any benefit at all from its ability, depending entirely upon what kind of units your opponent is playing, but if at any point you find yourself encountering a large number of enemy flyers, it could certainly be worth considering playing this unit. The only problem, however, is that if you're not benefiting from that ability, he's not really doing a lot for you. And if your opponent happens to be running flying units, if they can pick off your Rocket Boy, unless you have multiple copies or you're willing to invest attachments to bolster up his relatively insignificant 2 hit points, then it's pretty trivial for your opponent to destroy this character. And although you might benefit from him soaking up an attack from some enormous, dangerous adversary in the best of cases like a Black Legion Helldrake, in that he can take 8 damage that doesn't go to your Goff Knob, doesn't go to your Warlord, as soon as he's gone, then your opponent starts deriving the full benefit of that flying keyword. So maybe in the best case scenario, you're able to leverage a number of ranged attackers against your opponent before they manage to destroy the Rocket Boy, or maybe you have the initiative token so you can at least get in a full 6 attack value hit with your Goff Knob against your opponent's flyer before they have an opportunity to react. But despite having the possibility of increasing your damage output efficiency, there's nothing really too special about the Rocket Boy. And given the relative scarcity of flying units in the core set and throughout our upcoming Warlord and Planetfall cycles of war packs, at least from what we've seen so far, there's never been a really focused shift in the meta, in what people are consistently playing, toward frequent flying unit deck inclusion. So, despite not being loyal, although he is a warrior, which can be great with the likes of Colonel Strachan and the Elysian Assault team, he's really not going to do much out of pretty special cases that, at this point in the game, are just frankly unlikely to occur. So, certainly a card to keep in mind, but at the moment, it's probably a safe call to relegate him to the binder. Next up, we have yet another formidable Orcish army unit in the 4-cost rugged Killikans, with 2 command icons, a loyal icon, 2 attack value, 5 hit points, the vehicle and walker traits, the restriction no war gear attachments, and the keyword brutal. So, although its cost is far from insignificant, its command presence certainly is significant. And on top of that, it demands a certain respect from your opponent in having quite a bit of staying presence if deployed to a planet by its lonesome. It's got a rather deep pool of hit points, and that 2 base attack value, although it's not that high, can be bolstered via that brutal keyword in order to drive its attack up to a possible 6, if you're able to use shield icons to the utmost of their potential, or if your opponent unfortunately has no better than a very low attack value unit or small number of units with which to respond to your army. As with any medium to high hit point unit, the likelihood of it surviving, should it be committed to a planet alongside your warlord, is likely high, and again, if your opponent's not able to destroy it in one fell swoop, you can certainly strike in return all the harder. It's a damn shame that you don't have access to attaching any war gear to this character, just because whether you're looking in the Orc faction itself, or your Chaos or Imperial Guard allies, there are a host of different options that can make particularly brutal units all the stronger. You've got additional attack, additional hit points, and you've even got ranged, so that if your opponent is so foolish as to distribute a few tokens worth of damage to this unit, boosting up that base attack value, all of a sudden giving that brutal unit ranged allows it to strike incredibly hard prior to your opponent having any opportunity to respond. And, although it in part depends on when you can give range to one of your brutal units, that nevertheless has the potential to deliver an enormously unpleasant surprise to your enemy. This is yet another unit where Warp Storm can provide some fantastic opportunities not only to soften up your opponent, but to allow the Killikans to hit harder, even if that global damage distributing effect doesn't outright destroy some of your opponent's potentially most valuable units. This is another circumstance where if you're playing Nozdreg alongside the rugged Killicans, that built-in brutal keyword is a little redundant and that card real estate could have been better invested elsewhere, but this unit does strike me as flexible. It strikes me as powerful deployed to a planet where it doesn't need to rely on your warlord. And when you're looking at 4-cost cards for inclusion in your deck, certainly you'll want to compare this to the hardier, at first harder hitting, albeit lower command icon, equivalently costed Assault Valkyrie. But depending on how you're building your deck, depending on how free you're able to be with your resources, all of that information is certainly going to have a profound effect upon which other units you consider including. But moving right along from the relatively resilient and potentially hard-hitting rugged Killicans, next up we have our Shoota mob, a 1-cost army unit with 1 command icon, 2 attack value, 1 hit point, the warrior and boys traits, and no ability or game-relevant text whatsoever. So, it's a rather vanilla unit. You can scarcely beat the cost of a single resource. He has 2 base attack value, and although he's extraordinarily vulnerable to the likes of any number of different effects dealing even a single point of damage, he does nevertheless provide a base 2 printed attack value with which you can use against your opponent. If it just so happens that you're including this non-loyal unit, alongside Colonel Strachan, he can hit for 3, which at the cost of 1 is rather respectable indeed, and as with any warrior, his potentially leaving play gives you the opportunity to replace him with an Elysian assault team. Granted, he's frail, he's fragile, he's very vulnerable, but he is rather flexible all the same. You can use him to try and win command struggles, or you can put him at a planet where fighting is particularly dense, or you simply have the initiative token in order to quite likely derive some potentially significant gain from this guy. So certainly the Shoota mob is nothing special, but if you're looking for a bread and butter, hard to go wrong type army unit to include in your Orc, Chaos, or Imperial Guard deck, it's hard to pass the Shoota mob by. And while we're on the theme of inexpensive and, quite frankly, rather uninteresting, our next army unit is the Sniveling Grot, with an even lower cost of 0, a very paltry 1 attack value, a single hit point, and the runt and ally traits, with no game text. So, what is there to say about this unit? It's a free body that consumes one of your oh-so-valuable actions during the deployment phase, so that if you're playing 1 or more copies of the Sniveling Grot, you can push your opponent ever closer to passing and potentially rob them of the opportunity to leverage any number of nasty effects against you to the utmost of their ability, such as Exterminatus or Deception. The longer that you can delay putting some of your most valuable units or surprising effects into play, the less value your opponent is going to be able to derive from what could, in all likelihood, be absolutely devastating effects. For instance, if you force your opponent to pass, or they trigger their Exterminatus early, if you then proceed to put a Goff knob into play, they may very well not have any answer whatsoever to that army. So, the Sniveling Grot by himself doesn't have any useful synergy, but it's at the very least a card. It doesn't really synergize very well at all with our existing Warlord Nozdreg. Having a single hit point doesn't really combo with the brutal keyword, but seeing as how it's free, seeing as how it takes an action, seeing as how it can do a single point of damage to your opponent, it can provide some small benefit, The problem, however, is that even though it might be able to confer some early game tempo advantage, this is likely to be a very disappointing draw in the late game. And when I say things like this card is a free body on the table, or this card uses an action during your deployment phase, unless resources are exceedingly scarce, which may well be the case as the Orc faction tends to struggle in drawing additional cards and generating resource tokens, the value of pulling this card off the top of your deck is going to be very low indeed. And although Sniveling Grot isn't entirely insignificant, given that someone could easily argue that this is a complete waste of space to include in your deck, you're probably going to want to think very carefully indeed before including one or more copies. Even comparing this to something like a Penal Legionnaire that the Imperial Guard player can deploy, because the Orcs don't have those same inherent sacrifice a unit to accomplish some effect type cards that the Imperial Guard player does, you get even less benefit from any body on the battlefield. And although you certainly can use the Astra Militarum event Suppressive Fire to exhaust this extremely low value unit in order to pick and choose which of your opponent's units at that planet to exhaust, I think that players, even those wanting to give this guy the benefit of the doubt, are really going to find themselves struggling to justify including this unit in a deck. But in any case, next up we have a much more interesting, albeit much more expensive unit, the Tankbusta Bombas, with a cost of 4, 2 command icons, 3 printed attack value, and 4 hit points, the Warrior and Boys traits, and the text, "This unit deals double damage to enemy vehicle units." So, somewhat similar to the Rocket Boy, it effectively nullifies vehicular enemy flyers, in that if you're doubling the damage and then halving that damage, it basically assigns its printed attack value, but seeing as how this is a relatively hardy body on the battlefield, if you manage to benefit from that brutal keyword, you can increase that attack value significantly prior to applying that multiplicative effect. And in that same vein, if it just so happens that you choose to affix the rune-encrusted armor to this unit, giving it a base attack value of 5, doubled up to 10, allows it to single-handedly destroy all but the utmost resilient enemy units. And if at any point it does gain that brutal keyword in addition, then that one-shot capability becomes all the more likely and all the more possible. But again, similar to Rocket Boy, much as we don't see a large number of flyers in the game, we don't see a tremendous number of vehicles either. Just because at this point in the game's development, there are so many cards available that punish very expensive units, many of which in the Warhammer 40,000 universe happen to be vehicles. Even if you don't happen to be running up against many vehicles in your opponent's deck, by no means is this a bad contender for deployment alone to a planet, just because it does have a respectable pool of hit points, it has a pretty significant command presence with those 2 icons, and if you're able to generate cards and resources, because your opponent's afraid of that 3 attack value, then that could potentially be fantastic. And to add even more staying power to this unit, as a warrior, if you're allied with the Imperial Guard, even if your opponent has initiative and kills this unit outright, maybe if you don't have access to any shield cards or whatever the situation happens to be, if you can replace it with 1 or more Elysian assault teams, then you can potentially derive some pretty good benefit from this card. The more surprises you can drop onto your opponent, and in this case the pun is unintended, the better. So, while this unit certainly has the potential to devastate enemy vehicle units, at the moment, even if you do include multiple copies of this card in your deck, you're probably not likely to get to use him to the utmost of his ability and really derive the utmost value out of this character. simply in taking a look at all the different vehicles available to each and every faction at the moment, it seems like vehicles either have very low hit point values, like the experimental Devilfish, clocking in at 2 for the Tau, or the Astra Militarim's 3 hit point Mordian Hellhound, or they have flying, or they have so many hit points that without some sort of external assistance, the Tankbusta is simply not able to deal a killing blow with a single swing. The immediate example of the Ultramarines Dreadnought comes to mind, where even though you might double his swing to 6, that's not going to be the 8 required to kill that unit. Even if you have the initiative token, you're not going to be able to drop that Dreadnought before it gets a chance to take one enormous swing and either kill this unit in return or potentially bloody or decimate your warlord. So, certainly while it's possible the Tankbusta could be fantastic against enemy vehicles, it seems that even with that potentially rather potent ability, he's likely to need a bit of help. If they do happen to have a very high hit point unit, maybe you can essentially lull them into a false sense of security by triggering perhaps multiple copies of Orc Cannon, and maybe they end up assigning it to that unit, not expecting your Tankbusta, and then you can deploy it by surprise, either giving it range or maybe leveraging the initiative token in your favor to try and destroy that unit before they can find some sort of better answer. But certainly seeing as how the Tankbusta is vulnerable to Deception and Archon's Terror, there are a lot of different options that any given opponent may have to rout even your best laid of plans. So yet another Orc unit where the payoff could potentially be rather high, but all the same, it potentially sets you up for an enormous amount of frustration as well. Really, the last thing I can think of to mention about this unit, particularly for either newer players or those less focused on the strict rules and mechanics of the structure and framework of each individual game round, is to make absolute certain that you double the amount of damage he's dealing prior to your opponent's opportunity to assign shield cards, just so that you can get the utmost benefit out of this unit's ability, whether or not you're able to leverage him opportunistically to much effect. And always remember that in any situation in which you're increasing his attack value, whether it's through giving him the brutal keyword or whether it's running him in an Imperial Guard deck alongside Colonel Strachan, that effect takes place prior to your doubling the amount of damage you assign to an enemy vehicle. But on to our final Orc army unit, we have the Weirdboy Maniac, with a cost of 3, a single command icon, a loyal icon, 2 attack value, 4 hit points, and the Psyker and Oddboy traits, as well as the reaction after this unit enters play, deal 1 damage to each other unit at this planet. So, although this unit comes with a significant resource investment, it can nevertheless serve to fill multiple roles in any Orc player's deck. It does have but a single command icon, but it nevertheless could excel at challenging some of your opponent's command icon heavy units if deployed at a planet where maybe your enemy has a rogue trader or void pirate or other fragile command icon laden units that they're hoping to generate additional cards and resources or simply win command struggles with. That reaction is entirely optional and affects every other unit at the planet. So if only your opponent has units deployed there, then you're deriving no harm whatsoever from that effect. But all the same, if you have brutal units at that planet, or if you happen to have something like a bad Dok sitting at that planet, damage tokens can be a valuable resource in and of themselves, just because they might grant additional attack value or command icons, depending on the situation. Plus, simply as a body, he's very hardy with 4 hit points, so if it just so happens that you give him Brutal, you can potentially swing pretty hard, and even if that doesn't happen to be the case, 2 is far from insignificant in and of itself, so particularly if you're using him to win command, even though he might be a little bit on the expensive side, you could nevertheless use his attack power, his resilience, durability, and or ability in order to, if not outright win command struggles, at the very least, if you can force a combat, hopefully destroy your opponent or potentially send their command icon-laden units packing back to their headquarters. In the right situation, his ability has the capability of being devastating. He's probably at his absolute best against Packmaster Kith or Dark Eldar or any other deck that happens to run a large number of very fragile, whether or not they're hard-hitting, units. And although the Orc player doesn't have access to much area effect, they have full access to Warp Storm, and in conjunction with this reaction, you can potentially set your opponent up to suffer devastating losses. As with so many other surprise effects, he's probably best played as late during deployment as possible, and given that he's not only capable by himself, but that he unlocks a potential inherent to so many other Orcish cards, I think the Weirdboy Maniac is a rather compelling card, as we eventually see synergy for the Psyker or Oddboy traits. He's bound to get even better, and depending on shifts in the meta, whether it's toward or away from low hit point units, his value could increase or decrease dramatically. So this is certainly a card that's worth trying, yet probably also one that you want to keep an eye on based not only on its performance, but also based upon what your opponents during any given week or any given month happen to be playing. I think last, but certainly of paramount importance, is that you always want to remember that his reaction is entirely optional. So if it just so happens that you really need his stats deployed at a planet where you've got a number of Shoota mobs or Sniveling Grots, or perhaps just a large number of wounded units, if his ability is going to do much more harm than good, then it's probably best to hold off on triggering it, or to simply deploy him entirely elsewhere. Well, now that we've managed to successfully navigate our way through the Orcish army units, up next we have a single attachment, the 1-cost rocket launcher with 1 shield icon, the war gear and weapon traits, and it reads quite simply, attached to an army unit, attached unit gains ranged. So, beyond being cheap, beyond having the built-in benefit of a single shield icon, this allows an Orc player their only opportunity to benefit from the ranged keyword. What's particularly compelling about this only attachment the Orc player has within faction access to is that it synergizes so well with the Orcs, specifically because they have such inherent potential to access enormously high attack value units. If you're piloting Nozdreg as your chosen warlord, it's relatively simple for you to manage to grant a wounded unit Brutal, boost up its attack power by a potentially significant amount, and if you can guarantee that you're attacking before your enemy has the chance to attack you, you can potentially deal some enormous damage before your opponent has a chance to respond. But beyond merely having brutal units of your own, seeing as how Orcs are very free to ally with Chaos, you've got access to the Khorne Berserker, so even if you're not running Nozdreg or the Enraged Orc, through that unit you can still benefit from a brutal attacker. And if you do just so happen to be allying with Chaos, an absolutely fantastic candidate for this war gear would be Possessed, which in addition to being an elite, which makes it immune to the likes of Deception, has an enormous printed 9 attack value. And if you can guarantee that you're taking a shot before your opponent has the opportunity to act, that incredible 9 attack could easily bloody or outright kill your opponent's warlord, the linchpin of their army, some expensive unit, any number of different options. But with that 4 hit points, you want to make absolute certain that your opponent can't, say, use a ranged attacker with the initiative token to instantly waste that 6 resource token investment of yours. Any unit that you stick an attachment to immediately becomes immune to Warp Storm, and if you're running with Chaos, that might be something you're wanting to leverage to your advantage, particularly given all the synergy we've already discussed about how that global damaging effect could benefit your potentially large number of brutal, or in any case benefiting from taking damage, type units. When it comes to the ranged keyword, almost anything you can do to boost up attack power is never going to be unwelcome. Whether it's the Catachan Outpost or Rune-encrusted armor, each and every single additional point of attack value that you can accrue is going to make it all the more likely that you can absolutely devastate your opponent. And given this attachment's rock bottom cost, it's extraordinarily difficult to not see an Orc player including the maximum number of allowable copies of this card in his or her deck. And in a pinch, this could serve a fantastic effect put on any unit. Even something like a Virulent Plague Squad, so long as it's maybe later in the game and your opponent has been either discarding a lot of army units or you've managed to destroy a lot of their army units, whether it happens to be a low attack power unit or whether it happens to be something absolutely insane. Although this is the only attachment that the Orc player receives, the difference that this could make as to the outcome of a game is absolutely absurd. You just want to be entirely certain that, to the best of your ability to plan for it and prevent it, you try to make sure that you don't fall victim to an untimely Archon's Terror or other type of effect. But with our attachment covered, on to the first of a trio of supports. We have the unique 1-cost Bigtoobanna, an upgrade trait support with the limited keyword and interrupt. When you deploy an Orc unit, exhaust this support to reduce that unit's cost by 1. So, quite simply, this is a very inexpensive support that sits there on the table, so if you just so happen to be running the Imperial Guard Allied Army Unit Infantry Conscripts, this is yet another support that gives them a passive +2 attack power. This is a very cheap card, and importantly, the earlier you can play this, the more benefit you're going to see over the course of the game. But at the same time, it has the drawback of not only being unique, but also limited. So it does happen to eat up not only that oh-so-important limited restriction that, as our card pool continues to develop, is only ever going to get more and more critical, but it has the additional restriction of being unique. So the more copies of this you include in your deck, the earlier you're likely to draw it and start benefiting from that powerful resource reduction effect, but at the same time, the more likely you are to draw multiple copies of what's very likely to ultimately end up being a dead card in your hand. And particularly considering that at this point in the game's development, we've only seen a handful of Orc-specific cards that allow players to destroy supports, it's unlikely that you're going to have to count on having additional copies of this support in reserve just to make sure that you can play Orc units as cheaply as possible. Certainly, you've got a number of different options for different units that this can key off of. It's very potent when combined with nasty synergistic effects, just so that you can throw off your opponent's expectations as much as possible. So, if you manage to combine the effect of this support with Crushface, and on top of that, if you're playing Nosdrag and you can play Bigga is Better, it's possible that you can reduce the cost of a single Orc unit, maybe my favorite Burna Boyz, for instance, in that case, down to 0 from a base 4. There are certainly some cases where this ability might be redundant. For instance, if you're playing a Goff Boys at Crushface's location, you need not trigger this ability, so even though there may be a round or two at some point in the myriad number of Conquest games you play where you're unable to benefit from a possible resource reduction, given that this support requires you to exhaust it, and it does happen to have that inherent limitation of once per round because of that, I think the number of occasions when you have the opportunity to reduce a cost, but it wouldn't actually benefit you, are going to be extraordinarily few and far between. And seeing as how Crushface has the built-in restriction where units need to be deployed to his location, this basically just adds more flexibility with where you can put your units and still benefit from decreasing their cost. And particularly considering that the Orcs as a faction have some relatively expensive units, I think the more resources you can save over the course of the game, the better. Particularly if you happen to find yourself floundering to establish a strong command presence where you're feeling very limited as to the number of cards that you're drawing, very restricted as to the number of additional resource tokens that you're accumulating, and particularly if you're spending a lot of cards for the purpose of shielding, particularly considering how careful you have to be with damage if you're benefiting from that brutal keyword. Really, the more economic advantages you can give yourself, the better you're going to be. And plus, it's always worth considering that later in the game, the more actions you can take during the deployment phase, the better you'll be able to starve your opponent of actions. And if you can get him or her to pass, then the safer your army is going to be, and the more predictable your opponent's options. So, certainly I think the number of copies you decide to include in your deck might vary. It might change over the course of this game's development, but it's certainly an Orcish staple. It's important to consider that this cannot trigger in response to playing Chaos or Imperial Guard units, but nevertheless, it's hard to say no to a resource-saving effect like this one. Next, we have another very affordable support we've already rather thoroughly discussed in the Orc Cannon. It has a cost of 1, the weapon and artillery traits, and combat action. Exhaust this support to target a planet. Each player deals 1 indirect damage among the units he controls at that planet. So, quite simply, when you decide to trigger this action, you pick a planet. You look at your army, and your opponent looks at his or her army. Each of you assigns 1 damage to your respective armed forces, and then you move along. You can certainly play shield cards to mitigate that damage should you choose to do so, and of course your opponent has the same opportunity, but considering that this is not unique, and therefore it's entirely possible you might be able to trigger this 3 times each round, depending on the location you pick, your opponent might have to start either losing units or simply start spending shield cards in abundance. And of course, it goes without saying that each and every shield card your opponent has to spend is essentially 1 card wasted that you ultimately aren't going to see on the battlefield or played against you. Very important to consider is that even though you're going to have to wait until the combat phase to benefit from this action, is that this makes very short work of any of your opponent's low hit point, high command icon units, or that have any kind of abilities relevant to the command phase, like rogue traders and void pirates. Particularly if you don't have a unit at a planet where your opponent has either of those, you simply pick it for bombardment with the Orc cannon, and either your opponent wastes shield cards or they simply lose that unit. And beyond losing that unit, they also lose a little bit of game tempo, because during the next round's command phase, they either do not win that command struggle, you win that command struggle, or they have to reinvest resources in different cards just in the hope of having any luck whatsoever at potentially winning command at that location. Plus, this does synergize perfectly with Bad Dok in that it can allow you to swing a large number of command icons in your favor. So maybe if you were contesting a planet with your opponent, you not only kill off their weak unit or soften up their weak units, but you potentially boost your command presence by an enormous amount. It goes without saying that likewise this benefits brutal units tremendously, in that you're not just hurting your opponent, but you're giving yourself damage in a very controlled sense. Always remember that you get to pick exactly where this goes. So if a unit is too vulnerable, either don't trigger this combat action at all, or make sure that that damage does go somewhere where you feel that it's safe. If your opponent has any very low hit point ranged attackers, 1 or more copies of Orc Cannon could be fantastic to bombard that planet and overwhelm that unit. And this support could also be immensely helpful when it comes to potentially removing some stubborn units that are very difficult to deal with from the board, like an Honored Librarian or other potentially immensely frustrating attacker. I think that this support has the potential to be absolutely fantastic. It can not only force your opponent to make very hard choices, for example, do they want to give up their Sybarite Marksman or do they want to give up their Incubus Warrior, but additionally, if your opponent happens to put their damage someplace where it seems beneficial to do so, in conjunction with effects like Warp Storm, this could help leverage an enormously nasty surprise against your opponent. And if you happen to be the Chaos player, potentially running the Warlord Zarather, so important to consider is that this amplifies that damage if you trigger this action at a planet where that Warlord happens to be. And if you are taking advantage of that effect, in that case, you don't actually amplify the damage that your own forces suffer, so there are myriad possibilities when it comes to Orc Cannon. I see a hell of a lot more upside than I do down. Something else to consider about the Orc Cannon is that it could quite likely deter your opponent from committing their warlord alone to a planet, potentially to snipe some command struggle victory that they perceive as being important. Because if at any point their warlord's sitting there during the combat phase alone, you can trigger multiple copies of this support to bombard and very much punish their action. Or if they happen to have a number of low hit point tokens, like the potentially hard-hitting Chimera sitting at a planet, this could also serve as a fantastic means to get rid of those. Or if they happen to have a lone ranged attacker hoping to keep it relatively safe, solely based upon that under normal circumstances it'll get a chance to attack before you do, there are any number of devious surprises that you can use in conjunction or simply with the Orc cannon. So I think this is not only extremely cheap, but it's extremely versatile. Given the Orcs' predisposition and fondness for taking damage themselves, the options here are absolutely limitless, so I would strongly encourage you to give at least a couple copies of Orc Cannon a shot. So all in all, I'm definitely a fan of this support. But last but not least, we have a 2-cost support in the Teleporta pad. It's got the location trait and combat action. Exhaust this support to move a target Orc unit you control to the first planet. So, very important to note is that your Warlord is an eligible target for this action, as is any army or token unit you happen to control. This allows you a fantastic ability to react to any nasty surprise from your opponent, and if at any point they don't have any units whatsoever at the first planet, instead of simply allowing it to disappear into the void, unwon and gone forever, you can simply exhaust this support and move even your least valuable unit to the first planet, win that battle by default, and then add that planet to your victory display. You could use this support during an action window to pull either your Warlord or any valuable unit out of a battle that you're certain to lose. Or, if it just so happens that you're in the thick or midst of combat at the first planet, you can bring a powerful or brutal unit loaded with damage in after your opponent has exhausted all of their units to be able to get off one potentially devastating, potentially enormous attack, while that unit that you bring in goes potentially entirely unmolested. A little earlier in the video, I mentioned the incredibly potent combo of having a Goff knob absorb a tremendous amount of your opponent's attacks, ultimately get killed, and then in response you trigger Fall Back, bring it back into play at your HQ, only to use this support as a combat action to bring it immediately back to the first planet, ready, entirely devoid of damage tokens, and ready to start attacking and killing more and more of your opponent's units, and absorbing more and more punishment for your army. Certainly, in that kind of situation, you could use this support to absolutely devastating effect, particularly considering that even though you can only use each one of these once per round, seeing as how we have no means of unexhausting supports at the moment, but this is not unique, so even though it's a little expensive to invest heavily in these, and you might not want to draw multiple copies, you could nevertheless benefit from multiples of these each and every turn. Especially considering that there's always going to be a battle, whether or not that involves fighting at the first planet. The possibilities inherent to shifting some of your potentially hardest hitting attackers around the board I find enormously exciting, in that there are just so many different devious tricks you can play on your opponent, like bringing in a Burna Boyz so that you don't end up having it killed prior to its attacking because its pool of hit points is so low. It could strike out at one unit for 5, and then you could splash that additional damage where it might end up making all the difference between the life and death of a vulnerable enemy unit or a token unit, And you could also use this to bring in your warlord by surprise, so that if your opponent had been careless with where they're distributing the damage from their attacks, all of a sudden conferring Nosdrag's brutal ability to all of the units at the first planet, the things that you could do with this support strike me as absolutely ridiculous. So, certainly, if you're trying to give this support a try, situational awareness and careful planning with where you deploy your units is going to be of the utmost importance. But especially considering that you have an action window at the beginning of the combat phase, before there's any range skirmish rounds, the offensive and defensive possibilities that the Teleporta-Pad enables are just immense. And consider, too, that this has the flexibility of allowing you to potentially respond to an opponent's Archon's terror by bringing your unit, although it does stay exhausted, back to the first planet. This effect could potentially be amazing. It certainly takes a hell of a lot of skill. I think that in the hands of a masterful Orc player, that which they might be able to accomplish with the Teleporta-Pad could be absolutely terrifying and utterly debilitating to their opponent. But before I move on, I'll just mention that I think one final use for this support would be something so simple and straightforward as having Crushface on a non-first planet, deploying any Orc unit to his location, benefiting from that resource reduction effect, and then, during the subsequent combat phase, you simply trigger this action to shift that capable attacker up to the first planet, where it can hopefully help to start leveraging battlefield conditions in your favor. Well, to round out the Orcish horde, next we have 3 events, the first of which is the 3-cost Battlecry, with 2 shield icons, a loyal icon, and the power trait. It reads play only during a battle and has combat action. Each Orc unit you control gets +2 attack until the end of the battle. So, beyond its rather significant shield value, this potent ability affects any number of units. Although important to consider is that it only influences Orcs that you control, so any allied Chaos or Astra Militarum units are utterly ineligible to benefit from this effect. I think it's very important to consider that your opponent is probably going to be doing their combat math very carefully, particularly if you happen to be using that brutal keyword against them. And the sudden surprise of boosting up the attack value of each and every Orc you have in a given battle by 2 could be absolutely devastating and decimating against your opponent. Even though it's an enormously expensive effect, this can immediately shift the tides of battle in your favor to an absolutely insane extent, and alone this has the ability to win games. Maybe you have a hard-hitting ranged character thanks to an attached rocket launcher, and all of a sudden you're able to either bloody or kill your opponent's warlord. If they suddenly miss out on not only some fantastic ability, but also having a body there at that planet to sponge up attacks and potentially deal out some damage, then things are going to be looking bad for them immediately. You could use this to kill off their most valuable or hardest hitting, most expensive or hardiest units far earlier than your opponent was expecting, or if your opponent was anticipating an easy victory, maybe you could turn the tables on them entirely and turn their expected win into not just a narrow defeat, but an absolute bloodbath. It's of the paramount importance to consider that each and every Orc unit you have benefits from this. So if you, during your deploy phase, fill a planet with inexpensive, cheap, normally not particularly hard-hitting units, they nevertheless, each and every one, benefit from this effect, and even your normally lowly Snotling tokens suddenly have an enormous, dangerous 3 attack value with which to leverage against your enemy. Particularly in conjunction with the event Snotling attack we'll cover in just a moment, if you can fill the board with attackers, the value that you can derive from the inherently expensive Battlecry can be absurd. This benefits your warlord as well, and if your opponent was counting on having some clever means of countering one hard-hitting attacker of yours, like if they had a trump card such as Indomitable sitting in their hand, or they had Iron Halo affixed to their warlord and they were counting on being able to negate the enormously powerful swing of your Goff knob, if you can simply swarm them down by bolstered, buffed, individual attacking units, then this could not only take your opponent by surprise, but potentially easily win you the most decisive battle of a game. You just want to make absolute certain that you're able to save up enough resources to trigger this, and to make sure that your opponent isn't going to surprise you with some sort of devious means of snatching those away from you at the last moment. But even if you don't find yourself needing to deploy this event for its intended effect, it does have powerful defensive value as well, in that 2 shield icons is certainly nothing to scoff at. It's a damn shame that this is limited to one individual battle, and any units that happen to interplay after you trigger this effect don't benefit from that potent power-up. But nevertheless, taken as it is, this has incredible potential, and if you do happen to decide to run this card in your deck, it's definitely something for your opponent to be afraid of. And next, as I oh so recently mentioned, we have Snotling Attack, a 2-cost event with a single shield icon. It has the Tactic trait and Deploy action. Put 4 Snotlings tokens into play, divided among any number of planets. So, in considering this event, it's very important to keep in mind that Snotlings tokens, in and of themselves, are relatively inoffensive things. They have 1 attack value, a single hit point, and the Runt trait, which at this point in our card pool and the game's development doesn't actually confer any sort of beneficial or synergistic effect whatsoever. It has no effect on the game state. But what's very important to keep in mind with this event is that it allows you to put 4 of these tokens into play for a mere 2 resources divided among any number of planets. So if you're looking to leverage a small amount of additional combat ability at any number of different locations on the battlefield, you can dump these Snotlings tokens divided how you'd like, wherever you can get the most benefit from them. Although individually those tokens may not seem very powerful, considering that they are entirely eligible to benefit from Battlecry, that combination, although expensive, considering that it supplements the rest of your armed forces, can be enormously powerful. But even this event by itself, in the right situation, can potentially be devastating. For instance, if your opponent plays a single, very hard-hitting attacker at the first planet, something like an Ultramarines Dreadnought, a good answer to that would be playing Snotling Attack. If you've got 4 tokens sitting at that first planet, your opponent, in normal circumstances, unless they've got some sort of event or ability or area effect, anything like that, you're going to be able to get far more attacks in than they will. And even though that Dreadnought hits a hell of a lot harder than a Snotlings token, you can essentially destroy it strictly through having so many more bodies on the field. For instance, during the first round of that combat at the first planet, if you do happen to trap your opponent there, particularly if they're unwilling to retreat and they really want to win, the amount of punishment you can dish out is significant. Your opponent may get to attack first, or you may get to attack first, but either way, if they're only able to kill off one of these tokens each round, you're going to be able to amass damage much faster, because an attack value like 8, whether these Snotlings tokens have 1 HP or 6, it's still going to take 1 attack per token per kill. So, 4 tokens, if you've got initiative or not, that first round of combat, your opponent suffers 3 points of damage. The second round, they take 2, the third round, they can take 1, and if you've got that initiative token, if your opponent is bound and determined to win combat at that planet, your single 2-cost event here may have put 7 points of damage on their dreadnought, or simply force them to waste any number of shield cards. And consider too that all of this is going to be in addition to any other units you might happen to have at that planet. So if they're busy dealing with more threatening, higher priority targets, if at the end of each combat round you've got 4 Snotlings tokens taking pot shots at the enemy forces, you can deal a tremendous amount of damage. If they've only got low hit point ranged attackers there, or if they just have vulnerable targets, or they have their warlord there, you can do a lot more damage than your opponent might be anticipating simply through sheer numbers. And if it just so happens that your opponent doesn't have a good counter to this card, or any number of inexpensive units you might play to supplement this event, these could in all likelihood prove to be very powerful tokens indeed. While I certainly won't deny that it's entirely possible for your opponent to deploy some sort of hard counter to this, something like Tactical Squad Cardenas to a Mordian Hellhound, to something much harder hitting like a Vicious Bloodletter, there are any number of different answers to Snotling attack, but if you manage to catch your opponent by surprise, if you're able to deploy this very late during the deployment phase, possibly because you've been able to benefit from any number of different resource reduction effects, the amount of damage you might be able to do could potentially be enormous. And as with so many other things in this game, this card just seems like one more to really punish players from investing heavily in expensive, individual, hard-hitting attackers. Even something like a Black Legion Helldrake with its flying keyword, half of 1, rounded up, is still going to be 1. So these Snotlings may not seem like that big of a deal, but in the right hands, this event could nevertheless be used to absolutely fantastic effect. It's even got defensive value in helping to protect some of your own rogue traders and void pirates, if you're looking to establish or maintain some sort of economic advantage against your opponent. So this certainly may seem like a bit of a goofy card, but it's definitely worth considering deadly seriously. And finally, we have the last of our event trio in Squig Bombing, the 2-cost event with 1 shield icon, the tactic trait, and the text action, destroy a target support card. So, immediately worth noting is that within the core set itself, this is the only card that allows any player the ability to destroy a support. So whether you're playing the Astra Militarum, Orks, or Chaos, this non-loyal event could potentially provide the opportunity for you to destroy one of your opponent's most valuable cards. So, warlords like Colonel Strachan with his Omega Zero command post that can fill the board with guardsman tokens, or Packmaster Kith with her Chimera Den that allows her to shift those potentially deadly chimera to anywhere on the battlefield. Supports like that can make an enormous difference as to the outcome of a game, and those powerful one-copy signature cards in particular, they serve as the absolute linchpins in many cases of those warlords and those decks to try and beat you on the battlefield. And there are a handful of supports in this game that, if played against you, could potentially shift what looks like it's going to be a victory into what might end up being either a narrow or devastating loss for you. This card is fully capable of destroying potentially enormously powerful supports like the Catachan Outpost, and at its very least it can be used as a shield icon if it just so happens that your opponent doesn't end up playing any supports at all. The problem with this event is that often you're going to draw it, and you're not going to have a great target for it. And if you're only deriving the benefit of one shield icon from this card, then in all likelihood you'd probably have preferred to draw something else. Sometimes your opponent may not have a support worth destroying on the battlefield, or if you opt to play this card, you might be destroying a support that was less expensive than this event. So in that case, you ultimately invest more resources than this card may be worth. For instance, if you've been holding on to this the entire game, and your opponent plays an Imperial Bunker during round 5, 6, or 7, crippling their resource acceleration type effect at that point may ultimately not have been worth your drawing this as a dead card for the vast majority of the game. So it strikes me as a little expensive in that, given the supports we've seen thus far, in the best of cases, you break even with your opponent when it comes down to resource-to-resource investment. It's certainly worth noting that as we see more and more support cards released over time, that the value of this event does only stand to increase, but we also run the risk, as many players will say has already happened, of this being replaced by something else. For instance, early in the Warlord cycle, we see an Orc unit that has a repeatable inherent ability to destroy opponents' supports. And seeing as how events are so ephemeral, they're a one-time answer to something your opponent has played or done, something that you can actually deploy onto the battlefield and has a lasting, commanding presence against your opponent, is, in almost any case, going to be enormously more valuable. This is definitely a way for you to level the playing field against your opponent, but it's not necessarily a way for you to pull ahead. So instead of gaining tempo, gaining some sort of speed or economic advantage or any number of other benefits, you're kind of playing catch-up when you play this event. So maybe your opponent plays their support, they manage to benefit from it once, and then later you can respond with Squig Bombing. What is worth noting about this card is, at the very least, its ability is an action, so that you can do this immediately after your opponent plays a support, but if it just so happens that you don't have the resources required to play this card, or you just need to save those resources to invest elsewhere, in the worst of cases, maybe your opponent plays a support that you really want to remove, but they ultimately get to benefit from it a time or two before you're able to ultimately respond and remove it from the tabletop. So, certainly, out of the events we've assessed thus far, this one certainly strikes me as the most situational, the one with the most potential downside. For all of those reasons and more, unless you maybe know your opponent and know his or her deck very well, I just can't see taking the risk of including any, particularly many, copies of Squig Bombing, just because I think so often it's either going to be a dead card or simply put you behind by merit of your playing it. But now that we've covered the very last of our events, that brings our assessment and discussion of the Orc faction cards of the core set to a close. So, as always, thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel if you have not already done so. Be sure to leave a comment saying which of these cards is your personal favorite, which of these you've used against opponents to devastating effect, or share some devious tips and tricks you have when it comes to playing any of these cards. I always like to hear about gameplay experiences from novice and veteran players alike, and engaging with you and the rest of our fantastic community is the absolute best part of producing this channel. But with that said, thank you all yet again for checking out this video. Be sure to check back in for still more content to come, and I'll see you again soon.